Good morning and good afternoon, good evening wherever you are. Thank you to all the participants for joining our Asia Dialogue, which is co-hosted today by Climate Policy Initiative, Vivid Economics and Seoul National University. My name is Tiza Mafira. I am Associate Director of Climate Policy Initiative Indonesia. Climate Policy Initiative is an analytical and advisory organization that works with governments, finance institutions, and businesses to drive economic growth while addressing climate change. We have 6 offices around the world. So a little bit about why we're here today. Globally, the COVID-19 crisis has had a lasting impact and has forced governments to introduce stimulus packages to help their economies recover. While addressing immediate social and healthcare needs are extremely critical, a concerted effort is also needed to incorporate climate goals into country-level COVID-19 responses. Asian countries are no exception to the global trend of fiscal budget repurposing for COVID-19. And some of Asia's biggest economies, such as Indonesia, India, the Philippines, Singapore, and South Korea, have all announced dramatic fiscal interventions for COVID-19 response. Without embedding climate and other resource efficiency goals into the framework of economic recovery, countries could miss a golden opportunity to steer the course of economic growth, or worse, backpedal on climate environmental progress made thus far. So today, this high-level virtual dialogue aims to address the following 3 questions. Number 1, what are the priority areas of each country when it comes to economic recovery and fiscal support? Number 2, are there opportunities to make fiscal stimulus packages greener or use them as instruments for a greener recovery? Number 3, how and what can Asian countries do more to potentially collaborate? At the end of this discussion, we'll present to you, in the middle of this discussion, we'll present to you a little bit about our effort to map the greenness of the fiscal stimulus measures and their contribution towards country-level climate objectives. But today we have an esteemed number of speakers and panelists joining us. I will be starting to introduce them now. Joining us today are Dr. Barbara Buchner, Global Managing Director, Climate Policy Initiative, who will be providing opening remarks. Thank you, Barbara, for being here. We have a keynote speech by Dr. Muhammad Khatib Basri. Khatib is a senior lecturer at University of Indonesia and the former Minister of Finance of the Republic of Indonesia. Thank you very much, Pak Khatib, for being here. I will be providing a short presentation of the key findings of our study to set the context and then moderate a panel discussion. And our esteemed panelists today are Paula Alvarez, Assistant Secretary, Department of Finance of the Republic of Philippines. Thank you very much, Paula, for being here. Next, we have Mihir Swarup Sharma, Senior Fellow and Head, Economy and Growth Program of the Observer Research Foundation in India. Thank you, Mihir. It's a pleasure to meet you. And next, we have Mahua Acharya, CEO of Convergence Energy Services Limited, subsidiary under the Ministry of Power, Government of India. Thank you, Mahua. Good to see you. Unfortunately, we have just heard this morning that the Fiscal Policy Agency of the Ministry of Finance of Indonesia is suddenly unable to attend. But we do have some interesting discussions later that will cover Indonesia and India, as well as Singapore and South Korea and the Philippines. But a few housekeeping rules before we start. Please mute yourself. And then number 2, use the Q&A section to ask questions. We will only be taking questions via the chat box. I will be reading out questions to the panelists later. Please post questions at any time during the remarks and presentation, as well as the Q&A. We will answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A. And we will circulate the full report and the event recording as a follow-up to the dialogue. Okay, so without further ado, let me welcome opening remarks by Barbara Buchner.
Thank you so much, Disa, for the introduction, and it's a true pleasure being here with all of you today as part of this dialogue. So let me just try to build a little bit on what you started to say, Disa, and really set the scene a little bit for today's discussion. And let me start with, I think the dear facts here. Globally, COVID-19 has claimed over 2.4 million lives, and these losses are absolutely terrible. But COVID has further laid bare the gaps in society, but also the government's ability to address them in terms of social safety nets and weak points in the economy, impacting really the world's most vulnerable. Today, governments globally are continuing to roll out plans and cash for economic stimulus and enhancing social safety nets. But I think while we all can agree that rescue must focus first and foremost on addressing health issues, it is absolutely critical that governments and other actors focus this recovery phase on building social, economic, and financial resistance and resilience to be better prepared for a climate crisis that will be bigger in every way and stay with us over a much longer period of time. In fact, while COVID has terribly claimed millions of lives, estimates from experts around the world foresee that these numbers rise to 100-fold over the next decades should the world continue post-COVID into a business-as-usual pathway that sees greenhouse gas emissions continue at their current levels. Stemming the next crisis means that mainstreaming climate action into regular decision-making is the need of the day. We must continue ambitious action on climate change as the world recovers from the pandemic, particularly as trillions are being spent on economic stimulus. The question is, how? My organization, Climate Policy Initiative, has been at the forefront of bringing forth policy and financial solutions for a green recovery. And I'd like just very briefly to share with you on the 3 key ingredients that are emerging from this work. First, we see very clearly that good policies lead the way. They are key to resourcing a sustainable and resilient recovery. Green fiscal policies like pricing carbon, reforming fossil fuel subsidies, and procurement policies, as well as green budgeting, can be important elements in a government's COVID-19 response toolkit. Why? Well, such approaches support countries in removing inefficiencies in public expenditures and raising additional revenue, which can be directed towards immediate relief measures by supporting medium to long-term sustainable recovery planning aligned with climate objectives. Second key ingredient, it is even more clear now in the wake of the pandemic that we need to use public finance more wisely than ever before. With competing demands on public finance and rapid recovery needed, development finance institutions in particular have a major role to play. Development banks and international financial institutions can help build strategy and support policy development. They can deploy a wider range of instruments to manage, share, and reduce risk. They can convene relevant stakeholders and decision makers across the public and private sectors. And through these activities, they can greatly enhance what the private sector can do. Expanding their role in the post-COVID context is likely to be one of the cheapest and lowest risk ways to get low-cost finance to the green recovery and to climate action. The third ingredient is we do need to reset the whole financial system, and that's related also to the need for transparent data. In fact, now with the shocks to the financial system and real economy worldwide much more clearly highlighted during the pandemic, we are increasingly seeing actors like central banks and regulators also look to the next crisis, the climate crisis. For example, the Reserve Bank of India made statements to this effect for the first time in their annual report, and the People's Bank of China has announced it will begin grade banks on their green finance performance quarterly, starting this year. So this is really the moment in which all financial institutions need to ultimately align their portfolios with a better future. There's an urgent need to shift the entire financial system to better respond to, but also to help reduce and manage both physical and transition risks triggered by climate change, as well as to standardize related disclosure. Towards this end, my organization CPI is facilitating the development of principles for financing a sustainable recovery. And these principles are intended to build on existing efforts and provide the framework to signatories to help them ensure that the recovery stimulus funds and investments more broadly are used in a manner that address the issue of social and economic resilience and recovery and build for the future. Governance, of course, is paramount, and in fact, the coverage of the principles and associated signatories are expected to cover ministries of finance, central banks, regulators, multilateral and national development banks, as well as the commercial financial institutions. In fact, it is only when all players and overseers are aligned that we will see the right investments to help countries align their economies to those envisioned under the Paris Agreement and to those aligned with their own national determined contributions. And I do want to actually thank one of our esteemed panelists, Paula Alvarez, who is on our advisory council and who has been guiding this effort around the principles. So it's wonderful to see you also here on this panel today. But let me conclude that as we look to recovery, we do have a window to rebuild our world for a more inclusive, a more resilient and more sustainable future, targeting both short-term economic recovery and long-term structural changes aligned with sustainable, inclusive growth and aligned with strengthening society's resilience. Not doing so would pose a significant threat to a sustainable recovery and to the world as we know it, given the looming climate crisis. We risk closing that window, but I believe strongly that together we still can make it happen. And for this reason, I am back to Tisa.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for a warm welcome and an insightful remarks and for injecting a sense of urgency to the topic today. Next, we'd like to welcome a keynote speech by Muhammad Khatib Basri. Pak Dede, the platform is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tisa. A very good morning to all of you. It is a great pleasure that I can join the Climate Policy Initiative program this morning, and thanks for having me. In this morning, let me share my view on this role of the fiscal policy for the green recovery. But before I speak on that particular topic, perhaps let me talk a little bit about the current crisis, the role of the fiscal policy, and how the fiscal policy can contribute to the green recovery. Yeah. First of all, I think Barbara mentioned in her remarks that this is we are experiencing a very deep crisis. And then one thing that I would like to share with you, in my life, I've been experiencing several economic crises actually, yeah, including the global financial crisis when I was at the MOF and the taper tantrum 2013. But I have to say that this current crisis is a very different in the sense that it is an economic crisis, but it was triggered by the pandemic. And then the way we respond to the situation is also very different. Because, for example, like in the global financial crisis in 2008 or the taper tantrum 2013, we just had to deal with the economic issue. We stabilized the financial market, using both instruments, the fiscal and monetary policy. But this current crisis is very different in the sense that this is the economic recession that we designed. Why we designed this economic recession? Because we try to avoid the contagion. And one way to avoid the contagion is by asking people to stay at home, yeah, to restrict the mobility. As a result, the economic activities declined because of it. And Barbara mentioned in her remarks about that most of the fiscal policy are focusing on this social protection, support the small medium enterprise, the business, yeah, and also allocating the funding for health. So to me, there are three main objectives, three main priorities for the fiscal policy nowadays. Is getting the pandemic under control should be the top priority. That's the first one. The second one is because we ask people to stay at home. Yeah, we need to compensate that. People are paid to stay at home. That's the reason why social protection is very important. Yeah, a country like Singapore, country like United States, who have a very good, relatively good social security system, perhaps will not be in a difficult situation. But country like India, country like Indonesia, with a large population, yeah, with some issue about the social protection, it's not always easy to ask people to stay at home unless we compensate them. We provide, in the case of Indonesia, we provide the so-called the cash transfer. And last but not least is also will support the small medium enterprise to survive. Yeah, my concern about this current crisis, yeah, I do believe that, and hopefully that we will see the light at the end of the tunnel. But there is a risk of this K-shaped recovery because some group of society perhaps will graduate from the crisis because they have the access for the digital. They do have an access for savings. But what about the lower middle income group who doesn't have enough savings, who doesn't have enough digital access? So there is a risk of this rising of the inequality. So that is why in the future, the fiscal policy need to be designed to focus to address this economic inequality, focusing on the issue of the social protection, access for health, education, infrastructure, and to address this digital divide, and including issues about this gender mainstreaming gender issue. But besides that, I can see that one most of the important things that perhaps we can take, don't waste the crisis, yeah, we can take this opportunity, is to use the fiscal policy for the green recovery. Yeah, and I can see in many countries that the current stimulus is still focusing on the survival mode, not yet green and SDGs friendly. Yeah, but I do believe that there is a possibility that in the medium term, we perhaps, for example, like in the case of Indonesia, we probably important to learn about the experience from South Korea about the clean energy investment. And the reason behind it is because we are facing the situation of the relatively low interest rate in perhaps in the next 3 years because the quantitative easing this policy has been launched by the Fed, by the ECB, by the Bank of Japan. So in the next years time, yeah, 3 years time, then there is a room for the low interest rate, which is give a room for the investment, yeah, in the clean energy. But on top of that, I would like to mention about one thing. Let me talk specifically in the case of Indonesia and maybe some developing countries. Yeah, if we want to do a fiscal reform or fiscal policy which is related to the green recovery, one thing that we need to have is a political support. And the problem with many emerging economies or developing countries like Indonesia, people often see the problem of this climate, the problem of this environment as a luxury goods because they are busy in dealing with the day-to-day problem of the issue of health, of poverty, unemployment issue. So like it or not, we cannot separate the issue of this environment from the day-to-day problem. Otherwise, we will not get the political support to do this, using the fiscal stimulus for the green recovery. That is why we have to link the day-to-day problem with the environmental issue. So on this particular issue, I would like to propose one thing on my remarks. One of the biggest problems that many emerging markets are facing now is about the fiscal financing. Because as Barbara mentioned, the government need to provide the social protection, need to provide the allocation funding for health to getting the pandemic under control, need to provide money to support the small medium enterprise. The biggest question is, where is the money come from? Yeah, in some country in Asia, to get a support from International Monetary Fund is not always politically easy because the stigma in 1998. So one way to do it is perhaps the government should think about the source of funding that may come, from the allocation of the resources. So on this particular occasion, I would like to share my view regarding the fuel subsidy removal. Yeah, and I think the opportunity is now when the oil price is relatively low. We were probably about a little bit late. Perhaps if we did it about a couple of months ago when the oil price was still lower than the 40 US dollar per barrel or $30 per barrel, there is a room to do it. And we can use the fiscal framework, for this one. Because one thing that we learned from this process, the situation is the collapse in oil price represents a unique opportunity to eliminate the fossil fuel subsidies once and for all. And this will not only help the fight against the climate change, it will also allow the government to direct more spending and the poor and the finance crisis related debt. I call this policy as triple win because the money can be used to finance for social protection, allocation for health, and also to support the small medium enterprise. If any one of you from Indonesia recall on the 1998, the government, the central bank provided a bailout to help the banking sector at that time. That was something that needed to be done, but maybe politically not correct. But this time, this is economically sound and politically correct, because if we adjust the fuel price, we remove the fuel subsidy, and we use this money to protect the poor people, for the social protection, for allocating the funding for health, to support the small medium enterprise. This is also politically correct. So this is one thing that I would say that, to link it, the issue of the environment, to the day-to-day problem, because the biggest problem, as Barbara mentioned nowadays, is about the pandemic. So how to address the pandemic, how to get funding from the pandemic. If you look at the case of this, fossil fuel in many emerging markets, including Indonesia, the fuel subsidies encourage overuse of fuel, which has horrendous environmental implication. So as I said, my proposal is rather than subsidizing fuel, perhaps we should taxing to address the issue of the externalities. And that's possible when the oil price is relatively low. So rather than lowering the gasoline price, domestic gasoline price, to follow the world world market price, why don't you keep the domestic price at the remaining at the same price, and then put the difference as a surcharge? By doing this, as I said, we will be able to reduce the demand for the fossil fuel, which is good for environment. We can use the money, for example, like in the case of Indonesia, let me give an example. If the government introduced the surcharge about 1,000 rupiah, then our consumption to the gasoline is perhaps about 60 million kiloliter, is a very easy to get the about 60 trillion rupiah easily. And we can use this money for the social protection, to allocation funding for the health. I do understand that fuel subsidies are also an efficient way to help the poor, because in the case of Indonesia, the one who get a benefit from this fuel subsidy is middle and upper class, because they are the one who consume the gasoline through the consumption of the not through the public transport, but the private car. The link between the poor and the fuel subsidy is only through the transportation costs or the public transport. So if we reallocate the funding from this fuel subsidy to support the poor, I think this is something that politically also sound. And if you look at the data from the IMF, according to a 2015 review by the IMF, the richest 20% of the household receives 6 times more benefit in fuel subsidies than the poorest 20%. Yeah, that's exactly what I said. So in the case of Indonesia, Indonesia spent 3.1% of the GDP on fuel subsidies in 2018, but only 1.4% of GDP on health. Yeah, so this is a clear example how the fiscal policy can be used for the green recovery. And this presents an unprecedented opportunity to eliminate the fuel subsidies once for all. Yeah, it's not too late, but while the oil price is relatively low, perhaps we can use this, we can take this opportunity. Last but not least, I can see that in the future, once the government will start to design the fiscal stimulus for the green recovery, it is important for us, for the government, to use the fiscal framework as well. I remember in 2007, I was involved on designing the finance minister meeting for the COP in 2007 in Bali. Yeah, and one thing that we discussed, we cannot continue to rely only on ODA, overseas development assistance. Yeah, but we have to incentivize the private sector to participate on the issue of this climate change, on the environmental friendly issues. And one way to do it is to use the tax, the government budget, the subsidies, to incentivize the private sector to participate actively on the particular sectors that we think we need to support. Renewable energy, for example. We can impose, as I mentioned, the surcharge for the fuel or gasoline. At the same time, we can also provide, using the money from the removing of the fuel subsidy, for example, for the R&D, for the clean technology. So the case of the story of the clean investment technology in South Korea is perhaps something worth to be learned. Yeah. So I can see that in the future there is a room for any country all over the world, including Indonesia, to use this crisis as an opportunity for the green recovery and using the fiscal policy as a tools for a green recovery in the future. I think I leave it up here, and thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Khatib. That was very insightful. I liked the optimism for a greener medium-term recovery. Pak Khatib, imposed a very important question. How do we ground green economic recovery with day-to-day problems so that it achieves political support? And the idea of reallocating fuel subsidies in order to incentivize the private sector to participate in greener activities is, I think, an idea that you will find many friends here who will agree with that idea. But so in the words of Pak Khatib, don't waste the crisis. That provides a perfect segue into our panel discussion. Pak Khatib, I know that you might have other engagements today, but if you like, we would love if you stayed to watch the panel, and who knows, there might be some questions that you'd like to answer as well. I will leave it up to you. Thank you very much, Pat. Before going into the panel discussion, let me just provide some context setting. And for this, I have a short presentation that we prepared and that I'd like to share with you now. Here we go. So we present to you a study to map the greenness of the fiscal stimulus measures and their contribution towards country-level climate objectives. The analysis focuses on 5 Asian countries, namely India, Indonesia, the Philippines, Singapore, and South Korea. This study builds on the Greenness of Stimulus Index that was developed by Vivid Economics, whom we worked with for this study, to assess the sustainability implications of fiscal stimulus packages. So what we see here is that, we have 5 countries, large and emerging economies, and each have announced stimulus packages. The largest stimulus packages comes from South Korea, followed by India, and then Singapore, Indonesia, and the Philippines. As a percentage of GDP, Singapore has provided the largest share of recovery packages, followed by South Korea. So South Korea has the highest share of green stimulus measures as well. So this accounts for 53% of environmentally related measures. We're separating what's environmentally relevant and what's not environmentally relevant. That's why we have, kind of like neutral measures that don't relate to the environment at all. Coming second is India, that has allocated 31% of its stimulus for environment-related activities. Indonesia has directed 4% of its stimulus towards environmentally relevant activities. This comes to about, the greenness of Indonesia's stimulus comes to about 0.3% of total stimulus. Some of the policies that Indonesia has enacted to make this happen include allocations via PLN for renewable energy project development, some stimulus to develop village electricity distribution, and so on. As of the date that this study was completed, the Philippines and Singapore have included no commitment towards green outcomes. But just last night, Singapore did announce a Singapore Green Plan 2030, which set aside funds for transformative agriculture, electric vehicles, and infrastructure. So these policies are developing rapidly as we speak, and we might see more of these as we get into medium-term recovery plans. But right now, within the portion of environmentally relevant stimulus, the share of dirty stimulus outweighs the stimulus directed towards green measures in almost all cases. So if we index it, this is what it looks like. So while the current performance across countries varies, there are no net positive scores across the 5 countries. South Korea, supported by its government's substantial green policy measures under its Green New Deal, was the best performer. But across the countries, it's notable that those with poor baseline contributions, poor baseline environmental performance, and small positive stimulus contributions, such as Indonesia, failed to improve their index score. Meanwhile, large green stimulus packages, such as in South Korea and India, can elevate their scores from a modest baseline. So this provides, kind of a context for what we're discussing today. To ensure a sustainable recovery across the 5 Asian countries, there is a definitive need for governments to integrate green considerations into the design of their COVID-19 stimulus packages. And the following topics warrant further discussion. First, what are the priority areas of each country when it comes to economic recovery and fiscal support? Number 2, are there opportunities to make fiscal stimulus packages greener or use them as instruments for a greener recovery? And number 3, how and what can Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore, India, and South Korea, and other Asian countries do to collaborate more on this topic? So I'll start with Mahua. Hi, Mahua.
Hi, Tisa. Hi, and good morning to everybody on the panel. This has been a really interesting discussion so far. I've got a few questions. Sorry, go on.
Great. So Mahua, you know, some are calling COVID-19 the Great Reset. And I think Pak Khatib's keynote speech also emphasized how extraordinary this crisis is. So meaning that the economic recession due to the pandemic represents a unique opportunity to rewrite the future, particularly to achieve long-term sustainable growth. But what we're a bit anxious about is that this great reset resets us back to business as usual instead of better situations. So do you think the call for a greener future, a greener recovery is loud and clear, or do you believe that business as usual currently holds more sway over stimulus policies?
Okay, Tisa, so thank you for that firstly, and thank you for having me on this panel. Let me try and break your question down into 3 bits, Tisa. Do you think that this sets a basis to trigger absolutely new change? I think it's a known and it's a given that every single country, most certainly in Asia, is dealing with questions around the pandemic. And I think Pak Khatib said very clearly, you know, there is no choice for a lot of us. There's no choice for a lot of Asian countries. You can't close down. I live in Delhi, and life is back to normal with a certain understanding, implicit understanding of everybody that we have to continue to get on. And I know it's the case with a lot of Asian countries as well. So then what happens is that, well, you know, the focus is on vaccination. And so the questions around recovery are to make good or to recover first from the loss of economic loss as a result of the pandemic. There was tremendous economic loss across the world. There's tremendous, of course, human lives and so on. But the level of economic downturn, I think, has yet to be quantified. And we're still in the middle of this. We're still in the tail. We haven't quite reached the end of the tail. So the focus on rewriting the future, I'll be saying, well, of course, I'm an optimist. Of course, there is a realization that we have to do something a little bit extraordinary this time around. And a lot of these so-called fiscal stimulus packages, some of them are immediate reactions. In others, it's integrated into planning. And in India, for example, it's big chunks of it are in the national budget, in the fiscal budget. And I suspect it's the same for a lot of other countries. Korea announced a really big stimulus package in the middle of the pandemic. But going forward, a lot of what's in the package will then carry through in the economy, or should carry through in the economy. So I would say, well, of course, but I'm not sure that it's as simplistic as that. Meaning, of course, it would be fantastic, as it has been, and a number of European countries have sustained the effort and the discourse on green recovery. And that's probably the way to go. But I think in a lot of Asian countries right now, the focus is so much on economic recovery and how do we make good from all of the damage, and how do we get past this, the virus situation. And many of these countries have very serious social equality issues. And that remains a bit of a hang. So I'd say that, of course, you know, the answer is, well, yeah, I think every country realizes that we have to do something a little different this time. But I'm not sure it's as easy as a single trigger event of a large, giant stimulus package that will change the way the economy will run. These are complicated economies, they're complicated demographics, and I wish it would happen in a single event, but it's certainly been a wake-up call.
Right, thank you, Mahua. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, how this might not be solved with just a single fiscal stimulus package, or just, it needs to be embedded into, development goals in general. Let me move on to my next question to Mihir. Mihir, thank you for joining us. Just following up from what Mahua said, it's not just about the stimulus. When we think of green recovery, countries that are experiencing economic recession have had to deal with various fiscal setbacks and budgetary reallocation. So how has this affected spending and support for environmental protection and green development in your country? In India is not bad in greening their fiscal stimulus. It comes in second after South Korea. But do you think that that actually shows that there's less support now, or was it that the same as before, or more support?
Thank you, Tisa, and thank you very much for having me on this. And it's a vital discussion for us to have at this moment, and it's a vital discussion. It's vital for us to try and figure out exactly how Asian economies, in fact, compare when it comes to, greening their stimulus at this crucial point. I think that in the Indian case, we have to recognize that there are essentially there are multiple aspects to the stimulus which could be considered green and are being considered green, and as in your report, have been labeled as green. But overall, as compared to the thrust of government policy in previous years, this is a significant browning, I would say, of policy as compared to what was happening earlier. I think there are several points that need to be highlighted. First, there was a push for the privatization of coal, and therefore, in effect, for the extraction of more coal over the past year, after the pandemic hit. There was a reduction in the requirements, in the bureaucratic and assessment requirements for new industrial exploitation of forest land, a very controversial addition to the entire stimulus package. And even those aspects of the stimulus package and subsequently the federal budget that Mahua mentioned, which touch on green aspects, carry both pros and cons. So, for example, we could view the fact that there is a growing demand for a national subsidy scheme for batteries and electric vehicles and photosynthesis and photovoltaic units for renewable energy as a plus. And I think it's fair to label it as a plus. However, it's also worth noting that that comes hand in hand with tariff walls erected to keep those very products out, cheaper versions of those very products out of the Indian market. So in other words, what we're looking at here is taking what was earlier a push towards renewable energies, towards creating battery capacity, etc., and now trying to turn it away from being a green policy focused on the renewable energy build out to being a jobs and growth policy focused on investing in these, in the industrial capacity to produce these domestically. In other words, import substitution. So there is, which in turn, from the green transition point of view, will inevitably delay India's green transition while we get those investments into place. We don't know how long it will delay India's green transition, but we have to accept that although it appears to be a green component of the stimulus, it will in fact delay the transition. Now, a word on why this is the case, and I think we have to understand that, of course, as Mahua said, there are multiple different calls on the government's purse, but for some countries, for India's in particular, for some governments, the Asian governments, for India's in particular, this came at a time when their resources, particularly tax resources, are already under very considerable strain. India's tax to GDP ratio has been stagnant. In fact, has fallen if you look at it in a sort of 4 to 5 year timeline. And we are desperate for other ways in which to raise money. And we are very, very certain, in fact, that we can't spend as much money as maybe we thought we could spend a few years ago, which is why a lot of our stimulus has been regulatory measures, has been around questions of liquidity, providing insurance, etc., which don't require immediate spending, or has been promises of spending over the next 2, 3, 5 years. Which brings me to the point of maybe there is an entry point for greening, additionally, currently brown stimulus going forward, because not all the money for a lot of this stimulus has been disbursed. A lot of it depends upon, decisions that are made by bureaucrats a little further down the line, maybe next financial year. So we can't just give up just yet. So a little bit more to say, but I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mihir. As always, I think with questions on how green or how dirty, it's always a mixed bag. And so we're always looking for that entry point, as you say, or that tipping point where the green will eventually outweigh the dirty. So on that note, I'd like to turn to Paula. Thank you for joining us, Paula. It's an honor to have you. Fiscal stimulus packages are being rolled out aggressively, including in the Philippines. And I mean, even OECD estimates that recovery funds globally have grown to the tune of $15 trillion and counting. So part of these have gone purposefully towards green activities, but not a lot, as you're aware. So, but I think this still provides hope. What we'd like to know is, what do you think are the most promising opportunities to embed green recovery? What are the entry points to embed green recovery into stimulus package, in your opinion?
Okay. Thanks, Tija. Actually, just to echo what former Minister Kshaped was discussing a while ago, it's true actually that a lot of Southeast Asian countries and Asian developing countries are actually struggling to balance both the effects of the pandemic and the effects of climate change. So to give you a context, if you look at how the Philippine stimulus package has been rolled out, and based on the vivid economics, there is no greenness in the stimulus package. How we want to contextualize the findings is that first, we've already marshaled around 1.74 trillion pesos, or $34.32 billion in terms of stimulus. And the four main thrusts, or the four main priorities, are actually, first, what we did was to come up with pillars. So we have economic pillars to support the rollout of the stimulus package. So first, we came up with emergency support for vulnerable groups, which amounted to around $11.72 billion. And these were subsidy programs for 18 million low-income families and wage subsidy programs for those who actually lost their jobs during the lockdown. Then you have the pillar 2, which is the rollout of resources to fight COVID-19 in the first instance. So this was around $1.15 billion. So we needed to expand our medical resources. We needed to ensure safety and security of our frontline workers. And then we have pillar 3, which are the fiscal and monetary actions, which amounted to around $21.44 billion. And these are actions to finance emergency initiatives and keep the economy afloat. So these were standby financing for economic recovery plan and other support for local businesses. And fourth, you have the economic recovery plan, which we supported with additional cover from the House of Representatives in terms of appropriation. So this was also around $3.23 billion. So this is only the economic resources that we needed to marshal. aside from this, if you look at how our 2020 has been, we started the year with a volcanic eruption in one of our provinces in the southern part of the Philippines. And then we ended with 2 back-to-back super typhoons in November, which also devastated our rice growing area, which also contributed to inflation. Now, looking at how we budget our resources, the stimulus packages alone are not what we use to fund climate change and environmental activities. We actually have provisions in our law. So we have a law providing for a People's Survival Fund, which is a funding facility to help climate change projects, and these are accessible by local government units. We also have allocation of at least 3% for the budget of local government units for emergency funds in terms of disasters. And we've already depleted that at the first instance of the pandemic. And then we also have provisions for layering of financial risks. So we also have to pay for different types of insurance because we have, as we have been discussing earlier, Southeast Asian countries are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So as Barbara mentioned earlier, we have been working tirelessly with international partners and other multilateral development partners in order to help mainstream sustainable finance or climate finance. So how we wanted to approach the issue of climate change is that stimulus packages are not enough, given that developing countries such as the Philippines have a limited fiscal space, and we have a lot of socioeconomic problems that we need to first address before we could actually roll out green or climate initiatives in terms of budget support. What we're trying to do now is we're trying to come up with harmonized policies in terms of climate change. Recently, the finance minister of the Philippines has been appointed as the chairperson of the Climate Change Commission. And we are now working with them and all other government agencies. So we have a whole of government approach in order to harmonize the different policies and in order to see what are the gaps in terms of financing in order for us to unlock capital investments or foreign direct investments towards green or more sustainable projects in order for us to come up with a green recovery. So aside from that, our Ministry of Energy has already announced a moratorium on coal, and we are working with the central bank, the Department of Energy, the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as other government agencies in order to come up with a sustainable finance framework and a sustainable finance taxonomy in order for us to unlock investments towards sustainable projects. Because from our side, we don't have enough internal revenues to actually fund all of the emergency requirements to address the pandemic. So in order for us to balance our debt sustainability and our economic recovery, we have been working with people like, for example, Barbara's team in order for us to know what are the policies or what are the initiatives that we need to include in our priorities for us to unlock sustainable finance or for us to usher the flow of capital investments, especially in countries like Singapore, Japan, and South Korea, which are more advanced in terms of technology and in terms of capital markets. How do we work with them in order to entice their investors to invest, for example, in renewable energy needs of the Philippines? So these are things that we deem could be addressed not only through stimulus packages, but through a balance of combined financing means like mixed financing in terms of government subsidies or government guarantees or government capital injection and a blended form of financing together with capital markets and other development partners. So right now we're actually trying to mainstream how sustainable finance can aid in the recovery to top up the need to finance the initiatives to recover from the pandemic. So I'll leave it there right now. So thank you.
That's a very important point that we should not be looking at fiscal stimulus only to see what governments are doing to fund climate. And I think Philippines is an example where you might not have greenness in your fiscal stimulus, but you are trying to to other things outside of it, and trying to harmonize policies harks back to Barbara's welcome remarks earlier, where we do believe that good policies should lead the way, and public finance should be used more wisely to leverage, private capital. On that note, I have a question for Mahua, and if you don't mind, Paula, I'd like you to answer this question as well after this. Mahua, you've worked everywhere. You've worked in South Korea as well. You've worked in Indonesia, in India.
Yes, I think you're breaking up.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yes,
now you're back. I think my internet went a bit funny. Now you're back. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So my question is about collaboration. So as countries have been interacting closely with each other on economic, trade, and political levels, what can Asian countries like Indonesia, Philippines, and Singapore, in India and Korea do to work together in accelerating a green economic recovery? So accelerating recovery while at the same time spurring sustainable development.
These are long-term issues. There are already there's trade. I mean, the most obvious answer is trade. But going back to where we are today, the question is, well, what if I had to trade something in this Asian bloc, how would I prioritize? I think that's really the question. I've been in several discussions around trading power markets and the opening up of inter-country power markets. I mean, there is a lot of cross-border trade already going on, but that's perhaps something that has been going on anyway. And today, in a post-COVID world, if we were to go back to the drawing board and say, well, what would this kind of cooperation, what should it look like in a post-COVID, immediately post-COVID world? Well, there's an opportunity for a lot of new markets. There's an opportunity for technology. The kind of technologies needed today, as far as a priority list is concerned, are not about 500 of them. There's only a few. There's a few that is a need for today that will open up the market and hopefully open up the market for next year and the next 3 to 5 years. There's a lot of opportunity for technology-based collaboration that is in furtherance of green. It's not just the production of, for example, batteries. It's the production of stuff that goes inside the batteries. It's the production and the know-how of systems that go out to utilize those batteries. It's business models. There's a lot of discussion around business models, which is not always captured in a fiscal stimulus package or in any budget or in any sort of federal budget. These business models are, they represent know-how that comes out of collaboration. So there's a lot of opportunity around that. To be a little bit more specific, in, let's say, as far as climate is concerned, the underlying big chunk of discussion is the power sector in a lot of these countries. I'm not talking about vaccinations and so on, because that's, of course, it's a given. But collaboration around business models for applications of technology, as has been done in the US, let's say in California. There's a lot of work that's been done in Germany. There's a lot of work going on in Korea on high-end technology, which can be utilized in a lot of these countries. There's a lot to learn on coal with Indonesia, between the Asian bloc that still trade coal. There's a lot to be had on discussions around a common ground for how would one consider, I don't want to say phase out, because I'm not sure any of these countries are ready to phase out, but can we change the curve? So that platform, I think, would be the next chapter of discussion. And it should be the next chapter of discussion. But you see, most of these countries in this area are so preoccupied right now with fixing internal emergencies, internal priorities, that one tends to look out only when one is settled at home. So today's priority in a lot of these countries is just dealing with internal, how do I get past the virus and how do I get past economic growth? But hopefully, and I look forward to the day that we have a full-on deliberate discussion around collaboration with these countries. But I'm afraid there's a timing issue there. So we might have to be a little bit more patient when it comes to inter-country collaboration. I hope things like the COP upcoming in Glasgow maybe brings people together. Because that's one issue, and everybody comes together for that one issue. Events like the G20 and events like the BRICS and events like the SAARC summit and so on are good forums, but one has to be quite deliberate in putting certain things on that agenda, because left to themselves, countries are addressing their own people at home.
Thanks, Mahua. Yeah, there have been mention of or dismay that countries have seemingly turned inwards as the pandemic hit and less collaboration. Paula, do you agree that's the case? And is there a trend you see that towards more collaboration, particularly within the Asian bloc, and various other factors? For example, the Coalition for Finance Ministers for Climate Action, their discussion theme this year is about green recovery. So is there opportunity for more collaboration within this context?
Yes, I think definitely right now, a lot of countries are actually stepping up in terms of addressing climate issues. Indonesia has recently been announced as co-chair of the Coalition of the Finance Ministers for Climate Action. And we are looking forward to how they're going to lead the coalition together with Finland in order to address macroeconomic policies that are catered towards climate change. So aside from that, you have different multilateral financing facilities, such as the GCF, which is actually housed in South Korea. And South Korea has actually been very active in terms of trying to help countries, for example, give technical assistance into how could local government units access the fund, what is considered an adaptation or mitigation project. So South Korea has been actually leading in terms of that space. Aside from that, you have countries such as the Singapore and Japan. We're actually working with Southeast Asian countries also, such as the Philippines, in terms of, for example, addressing disaster risks. So we've been working with the Monetary Authority of Singapore and Japan in terms of building on the SEADRIFT, or the Southeast Asian Disaster Risk Infrastructure Facility, which aims to pull in risks and diversify them in order to make insurance products more affordable for low-income countries. Aside from that, you have different forums such as the APEC, where, for example, previously when we had the APEC in Chile, they came out with the Santiago Action Plan, which actually helps countries mainstream sustainable or climate finance in terms of their policies. So there are a lot of fora where countries can actually work together and share their experiences and share what they have been doing in order to learn from each other. So what we could see is a more regional cooperation in terms, for example, of addressing carbon pricing instruments, or for example, how could Singapore lead in terms of showing other Southeast Asian countries that urban development doesn't need to let go of considerations of the environment, because they have been showcasing that Singapore now includes urban agriculture or greening the urban cities. So how could countries such as the Philippines and Indonesia adopt what Singapore has been doing in terms of modernization, or how could we learn from what technologies South Korea and Japan has been developing? So I think these are areas for cooperation that we see could actually move us towards a green recovery. Also, technologies such as digitalization, and in terms of banking and finance that addresses the accessibility for example, in the Philippines, we're an archipelago, and some of our people are located in far-flung areas where support cannot be reached. So how can digitalization, how can technology help address the unbanked sector? So these are things that we could work into, that Southeast Asian countries or others, Asian countries are actually leading. So you have Singapore, you have Japan, you have India as well, in terms of technology development that has a lot to offer. So I think these things are issues that we need to talk about in order for us to learn more from each other. And I think there's a lot of room for us to develop in that area.
Thank you, Paula. And I guess there's room as well within those fora to discuss how to tip the balance, right? Between how many measures, how many collaborative measures we have on that are more kind of dirty measures, fossil fuel investments, and how do we tip it towards more renewable energy investments, renewable technology sharing, and things like that. Thank you very much, Paula. And back to Mihir. We have been discussing a lot now about what policies can do and how public finance can be used to generate or to push a green recovery. What do you think is the role, or should be the role, of non-state actors in this sphere?
Well, I think that if by non-state actors, I mean, the most crucial one here has to be private sector capital. Because at the moment that we are at currently, we do have resource-constrained states and states which have a great deal else to spend their money on. And we need to be able to ensure that in some sense, private sector is incentivized, the private sector is incentivized to fill some of the gaps that we are worried about. And some of the gaps that we are worried about in particular is making sure that funds flow continue to renewable projects, that other social and green infrastructure projects get initial funding, that seed financing for green-focused startups in this area is somehow found. Now, for this to happen, and I think that this is actually where we need to start thinking about how inter-Asian conversations in particular can help. Because one of the big disincentives, well, the biggest disincentive to ensuring that this kind of private sector capital flow occurs at the level that we need it is that, by and large, most of our governments have problematic, most of our sovereigns have problematic ratings, which makes it difficult for debt capital to flow. And on top of that, those ratings are under pressure right now because we are spending lots of money. But I think that where we need to try and figure out alternatives is, can we carve out new institutions, new instruments that target green infrastructure, renewable infrastructure, other forms of NDC-focused infrastructure that are not limited or do not have the sort of ceiling imposed on them by the government sovereign ratio. And here we need to figure out what role public sector insurance can play, what role we can figure out for blended finance. One idea that I've been trying to push for some time, for example, and since the GCF was mentioned, is that if the world is not willing to commit, if the developed world is not willing to commit funds to the GCF to the degree that they originally planned, why not try and figure out if there's an alternative deal to be made in terms of guarantees? So instead of actually money payouts, can we at least ensure that that money is there as guarantees to allow for example, insurance funds from Norway to put money into a renewable energy project in Malaysia? Right. So what if a country in the West has not been able to pay up into the GCF to the degree that it should, maybe it can put that into a guarantee to its own banks or to its own private sector capital pools of private sector capital, in order to incentivize them to move out of the country and into green infrastructure in Asia. But these are conversations that we need to start having first within ourselves, and then I think we don't actually have that much time, because COP26 is at the end of the year, and if we miss the COP26 opportunity, that's going to be a real problem, because this is going to be a finance-based COP26. It's hosted by the UK. If we're going to see a finance thing on the agenda, it will be at this COP. And finally, because the next two G20s are going to be in the Indo-Pacific, it's going to be after Italy, it's Indonesia and then India. And so it has to be our concerns that are put forward through the G20, and if they're framed by COP26, then we can put them on the agenda at G20 Indonesia.
Very much, Mihir. That's a great point, and I hear you saying less payouts, probably, yeah, and more leverage, I guess, to leverage private capital, and meaning maybe less, subsidy type spending, and more towards, instruments like insurance and guarantees that will attract private finance. I think that's a very important point as we go forward, looking at, medium-term green recovery. I'm now going to open to questions from the audience, and we have a question here that I'm going to ask all the panelists to answer, starting with Mahua, and then Paula, and then Mihir. So the question comes from Mr. Mecca, and it says, as the market is transitioning from defensive/safe haven sectors, such as banking and healthcare, towards cyclical sectors, such as commodities, energy, and technology. As countries recover from the pandemic, what can governments do to drive this appetite towards green sectors instead of others? Is that clear? Mahua, would you like to answer that first?
Sure, Tisha. Never underestimate the market-changing potential of a policy signal. Never underestimate that. When a government says, even without a substantiating policy at the back of it, when the government says, I'm going to move towards recycling plastic, it starts the discussion amongst industry that perhaps the economy is going to take plastic seriously, or plastic removal seriously. And I think this is across the board. Never underestimate the demand signals that are created from policy signals. However, of course, if the policy signal or an announcement has no follow-up, well, I mean, that's a different matter. But I'm talking about situations where perhaps not every time can you announce to the economy that tomorrow I'm going to eliminate plastic. That never happens and should never happen, and generally does not, and should never happen. There have been certain instances, but I would say if in a recovery situation or in any kind of ship steering kind of scenario, policy signals by way of announcements, by way of intentions, desires, ambitions are fairly powerful, because they start a conversation amongst trade and industry. They start a conversation amongst trade unions and bodies about how to respond to that. And those responses are anything from, I'm going to invest in R&D, I'm going to invest in technology, to I'm going to stave off that regulation. But so never underestimate the power of announcements to the economy. And let's be honest, in this Asian region, the government is still at the wheel. It's still at the wheel, even more so in a post-virus world, post-COVID world.
Thank you, Mahua. Paula, would you like to answer?
Yes. Following on what Mahua was discussing, that's actually true. In the case of the Philippines, the Secretary of Finance, as chairperson of the Climate Change Commission, is pushing for the ban of single-use plastics in the country. So both houses of Congress are actually working towards a solution together with manufacturers and all the affected sectors on how we can ban single-use plastics without actually providing a huge loss of employment in terms of that industry. Aside from that, you have policies such as, for example, the announcement of the Department of Energy on the moratorium on coal. This actually has provided good signals. As we can see in our Philippine Stock Exchange, those conglomerates which actually have investments in renewable energy, their price of shares actually went up. So we have that for the Aboitiz Group and other sectors that actually floated sustainable or green bonds to fund a geothermal plant. So aside from that, you have senators and congressmen now looking into what other laws or what other support could they provide the executive branch in order to properly create or to properly roll out a feasible NDC target or a feasible NDC plan. So we are looking at areas such as, for example, our housing. How could you include more greeneries in terms of urban development? So how do we include that in our NDC targets? Because now the Secretary of Finance is also chairing the crafting of the NDC of the Philippines that we plan to submit by the end of February. So aside from that, how could the finance ministers or how could the economic group could actually steer different sectors? Or there's really huge potential in that area right now, since what the pandemic has caused actually triggered a lot of more environmentally friendly solutions, because now, for example, people prefer riding their bicycles. People prefer living in areas with more greeneries, because certain studies, which we're not yet sure if they're verified, show that if you are in more open spaces or if you have better air quality, then it reduces the transmission of the virus. So these are things that we're now looking into. People prefer more livable cities with more greeneries and better air quality. So how do we address those in terms of market solutions? So your private sector also plays a big role in trying to steer and in support of what government has been doing. So in the Philippines, that's what we're trying to do now, because we're really grappling in terms of reviving the economy and reviving it in a more climate friendly or climate sensitive manner. Because as we have recently been talking about, even if climate change hasn't been felt by most northern or other countries situated in the other part of the globe, Southeast Asia has been experiencing the effects of climate change, and it's becoming worse. For us, our typhoon season now starts from June and ends in December. So that's half a year of just typhoon. So what could we do to address that? So those are pressing matters that we think could be addressed, not just by stimulus packages, but also by fiscal policies and other measures that we need to work with the private sector.
Thank you, Paula. Mihir?
Well, I think that's a very good question about what happens now that we can see the commodity price cycle is beginning an upturn. And I think that we need to step back for a moment and try and figure out what it means that private sector capital is once again flowing into commodities. It means that there's an expectation of these stocks, these sectors in the future being essential to drive growth in the next year, 2 years, 3 years. How we can sort of green that movement of capital is an interesting thought. One way could be to, for example, highlight those and define commodity sectors more broadly, define the notion of growth-focused infrastructure more broadly. For example, we're also seeing interest in private sector money moving to hydrogen projects across many countries in this region, right? Now, that's we should think of that as a commodity as well. Definitely, if I go to an investor sitting in Wall Street and say, you're thinking of copper, would you also think of rare earths or hydrogen going forward? That investor is likely to at least think about it. It's not going to dismiss it out of hand because it comes from the same instinct, broad macro instinct that they began with. So we need to be able to provide green-focused alternatives that people think are making the same bets on this being central to the growth revival in our economies going forward. That's point one. Point two, in spite of the fact that, yes, it's true that we're beginning to see this big bet on commodities happen again, just like happened after the stimulus packages that followed the great financial crisis of 2008. But the big difference this time around is that we've also seen over the past 12 months an enormous growth in the funds and financing associated with ESG projects and ESG bonds broadly defined. And not enough of that money, not enough of that financing has begun to flow to countries in the Indo-Pacific. It's not enough has begun to flow to our countries. We need to be able to basically sit down together and start talking about what norms we have in common and what norms we can develop in common that would be able to help rate our projects, help rate our bonds, and incentivize the trillions of dollars essentially that have moved into ESG financing over the past year to start coming in this direction.
Thank you, Mihir, and thank you to all the panelists. I think that we do have a common thread here that when we discuss the role of private sector actors, non-state actors, it does still come back to the importance of policy signals. And so I think we are in agreement that public finance has a large role and it needs to be used more wisely to drive the market. And fiscal stimulus may not be the only or the sole solution to drive greenness in Asian countries, but it is scrutinized by many as a policy signal that has the potential to drive private investment one way or another. Thank you very much to Mahua and Paula and Mihir for joining us today. The study that CPI is publishing with Vivid Economics and Seoul National University is live on our website, and the link will be provided in the chat box right now. There you see it now. And so go ahead and download that. And we hope to have actually more discussions, more webinars on this study in the near future. So stay tuned for that. Thank you very much for joining us, to all attendees and to our esteemed panelists. Thank you for a lively and insightful discussion. The recording for the event will be available on our website within 5 business days. And this concludes the dialogue. We're right on time. So I wish you good health. Thank you very much for joining and hope to see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, and thank you everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Mihir, Paula. Thank you, Mahua.
Thank you all.